All right, hey everybody, Dan here, and I still need to do a chart of the day or fits in five thing, but because of what's happened, I figured I'd just go live with it and do it that way. It's not intended to be very long at all, but I think it's important just to point out a couple things, not just to members, but to anybody on my email list. Now, if you were if you were at my live session this morning, guys, and I mentioned it in the morning note, don't be trading these oil stocks. Don't be trading this big, massive move up because it's the type of thing that can end, it can reverse in a heartbeat. Or if the conflict and the war and the uncertainty and all that just goes on and on and on, gradually the uncertainty, the risk premium, the uncertainty premium, the oh shit premium, kind of starts evaporating and goes out of the price of oil. But it's just like let me put it this way: if you're trading oil or energy, you're going like, ooh, Strait of Hormuz or Iran or kaboom, whatever. Oh, oil go up. That's not an edge. Everybody knows about this thing except, I don't know, the dead. Everybody knows about what's going on. And so it's not the type of thing that you want to be messing around with. And so what we saw is, and I'll be honest with you, I was working on other things, as I mentioned to people this morning, that when the market's really, really jiggy, if things don't fit my process, I'm not going to sit there and say like, okay, how can I give my money away? What's the best way for me to give my money away by doing stupid stuff? It's best to just kind of push away from things. And so you could say, oh, well, you missed the reversal. All right, well, let's go through this real quick. I'm going to take my ugly mug off of this thing if I can. It's challenging for me a lot of times just to figure out where everything is. So, okay, I'm gone. Now, so this is oil. And if I recall, I shouldn't say I recall, I don't really know. I get the sense that Trump said, well, we might take over the Strait of Hormuz. And I think that's probably what caused it, maybe not. But the thing is, Trump, and we don't deserve Trump. No question about that. He could say later, he could go like, wow, I just had too many Diet Cokes, you know. Um, but the point is, something happened. And frankly, does it even matter? If you look up at the top here, oil USD 87 down 25% in a heartbeat. So that can be a problem for people that were long. And I actually just talked about it again this morning, about this, like the kind of the cascade of selling, just the cascade of selling that can go on. In fact, I didn't intend to do this, but here I go. Okay, let me flip this around. I'll walk you guys through. Okay, so here's the thing, like during these times of uncertainty, you get quant de-risking. Like there's quants that just trade dislocations. They trade momentum, the huge momentum traders. This is CTA, Commodity Traders Association, trend systems. Then the options, there's gamma effects, and I'm not going to go into this now. I went into it a little more detail in the morning, but the point is when there's out of the money call option, well, it doesn't even have to be out of the money. When there's a massive amount of call options or put options that are sold, the market makers in those calls and puts have to hedge their bets. And so that can really exacerbate any move that's there. And so in this case, it's been all to the downside. And then there's also margin calls. All right. And so then there's just like the bids dry up. And so what does that mean? If the bids dry up, that means there's a lot of money. A lot of dollar bills people are holding and they're not looking to exchange it for stocks. And then finally, you'll get this stop loss cascade of you'll get this stop loss cascade where on a particular stock or whatever, maybe it's the S&P or whatever, stops are hit and then that drops prices down, which hits more stops, which causes more selling, et cetera, et cetera. So there's just a really, really nasty feedback loop in these kinds of markets. And then you get fund redemptions where, hey, I want my money back. I don't want to play anymore. Where it's just like, thanks, it's not for me right now. And then finally you get this big domino effect. And so that's kind of where we've been. And we may be there for a while with respect to the stocks, but with respect to oil, this was the epitome of a gamma squeeze going up, where there's more and more buying and more and more buying, and the shorts are getting crushed. And then finally, the shorts have to cover. And then at that point, suddenly the bids drop out, and here we are down 24%. So I'm going to get to, isn't this nice? I'm going to just get to some stocks like the airlines, which have kind of been imploding. And now I just want to talk. I'm not going to go through in a lot of detail here. This is just supposed to be a short video. But I want to talk about things that are short-term trades like tomorrow. I don't know, maybe into Wednesday or something like that. But these would make really, really good 59-minute trades just using volume weighted average price, opening range breakouts, a few other things. So you get the airline index, which has been just taking it in the shorts, down 30% from top to bottom in how many trading days? In 19 in a month, in 19 trading days down here. But look at the big, massive reversal here. This really, really exploded higher. So we look at some of these airlines. Delta, this was one that I pointed to this morning during the session, saying like this is probably going to be a pretty good trade to the upside. It was kind of forming a hammer pattern right here. And then this has just continued higher. So unless there's some other headline risk, guys, this can be a trade that you can take. I don't know how many days it'll last. Could be for quite a while. But if you're buying this stock, you're going to make money. United Air, same thing. If you're buying the stock, you're going to make money. Look at the volume, more than twice average volume on this. American, massive volume. Okay, this is a capitulation low here. Even just look at the SPY, you can see definitely like a bullish engulfing pattern. The Qs, well, these have been locked in jail for a while, but we'll see what gold's doing. Nothing. So like this, the trade is away from gold. Even the energy sector, this one down like slightly. This down not even 2%. So we're not getting a lot of movement in a lot of the things that you might have expected. But if we just look at this, like Halliburton, this is looking like it's a pretty good buy right here. I put this out earlier. A pretty good buy right here. Schlumberger, not quite so good because it's really kind of sold off more, but you'll probably get some movement there. Meant to do this one. Exxon, no. CVX, no. COP, no. So where are we really? We're at Halliburton. Like that's the way I look at it. Not so much slob, but Halliburton, I'll take it. EOG just continues to go. So here's your trade really on Halliburton, and you can be buying it right here, and then you'd keep a stop just a little bit below the 50-day moving average, and that gives you less than 4.5%, about, we'll say 4.5% to the downside. So all this needs to do is run up to about 36, 36.20, and you've got a one for one risk reward, which I think can definitely happen. So guys, this is, in my mind, this is a really, really good, this is a really, really good risk reward trade for, for the long side. But how long this is going to last, I don't really know. We're subject to major, major headline risks. That's always the case. Trump can say, well, the war's over. And then 5 minutes later or 5 hours later, somebody says, well, we'll see about that. Oh, we're going to take over the Strait of Hormuz. Oh, fantastic. Everybody, sell energy. And then, oops, well, maybe we're not. Something blew up. So, that's just this market. Like that's the way we are here. And my suggestion is, as kind of always, is protect your money. You want to grow your money, so you can't just stay on the sidelines all the time and never come onto the field. But it's also important to know where your edge is. And like I said, buying oil stocks like yes, or selling oil stocks or buying oil stocks right when we're in the middle of a big upheaval is definitely not where you get your edge. What you want to do is wait for these snapbacks when the market's really, really volatile. Wait for things to be super, super clear, really, really clear. But you will never see things that are really, really clear when you're in the thick of it. That phrase, the fog of war. And I'm not talking about the battle now. I'm talking about the battle between in your ear. Well, between your ears is your head, is your brain, which most people like to think works all the time, but a lot of times it doesn't. If you're really, really in the heat of battle, just always looking at your screens, always looking for this, always in positions that are going to work. Oh, crap, they don't. Oh, I got to get out. Oh, I made a mistake. I need to get in. Oh, look at there, over there. There's a squirrel. If you're doing that, you're really going to miss like the macro view, and you're going to miss the big moves. And so I'll kind of go back one more time, and then I'll let you go. If you like Halliburton, I think is a good one tomorrow. I think Delta, you're going to get a nice lift there. JetBlue, you're going to get a nice lift there. Love, going to get a nice lift there. Um, I can't. There, RYAY, forgot the ticker. Uh, this, not so much. Forget about this. Love. Okay, you're going to get a nice lift there too. So any of these stocks that have this kind of gap down and then a really, really strong close, these are the ones that are going to give you really, really good trades tomorrow. Delta, massive volume here, huge volume. This was a massive capitulation here. And so you're going to get more upside here. Now, don't ask me, oh, well, will we go to new highs? Sure, one day, but I don't know when. So just kind of keep your wits about you, and you're gonna do fine in this market. But if you start like trading just to trade, that's going to be a big problem for you. Okay, so don't do that. Make sure you make the right trade as opposed to trade right now. There is a difference. You can trust me. Okay. By the way, if you've got any feedback on this, if you like me doing this kind of stuff, definitely let me know. Okay. If you're a member, post it in the trading room so everybody can see it. If you're not a member, you can email me at my personal business address, Dan Stock Market Mentor. Let me know if this works for you. Guys, I appreciate it. I'm surprised I got so many people coming on, but I'm pleasantly surprised, we'll say. So you guys, thanks for showing up. Loving you right back. And let's go get them tomorrow. Go Delta.